Before its violent end at the hands of a British force, the Kingdom of Benin was actually one of West Africa's oldest and most powerful states. Situated in what we now call southern Nigeria, its history stretched way back to the 1200s. By the 15th century, Benin had entered a golden age, becoming a highly organized and influential society. The capital, Benin City, was honestly a marvel of pre-colonial engineering and urban planning. Its streets, illuminated at night by palm oil lamps, were laid out in a grid. An immense system of defensive walls and moats, known as the Benin Walls, stretched for thousands of miles, a true testament to the kingdom's power and the sophistication of its people. At the heart of this formidable kingdom was the Oba, a ruler who was both the political head and spiritual leader of his people. Considered semi-divine, the Oba held ultimate authority, his palace serving as the administrative and cultural center of the entire kingdom. The history of the Obas, their triumphs in battle, and the key events of their reigns were not written in books but instead cast in metal. The famous Benin bronzes, those intricate plaques and sculptures made of brass and bronze, adorned the pillars of the royal palace. These were living historical documents, a library cast in metal that preserved the memory and lineage of the kingdom for all to see. The kingdom's wealth was built on regional trade, but from the late 15th century, it entered a new era of global commerce. Portuguese ships were the first Europeans to arrive, establishing a trading relationship that would last for centuries. Benin offered goods like pepper, ivory, and later palm oil. In return, the Europeans brought firearms and crucially brass manillas, bracelet-like objects that became a form of currency. The kingdom participated in the transatlantic slave trade, selling captives from its wars. The vast quantities of brass obtained through this trade provided the raw material for the artists who created the magnificent bronzes, transforming a symbol of commerce into a medium for cultural expression. This early relationship with Europe was, for a long time, conducted on Benin's terms. The Oba controlled all foreign trade, deciding what could be sold and at what price. He maintained a monopoly that ensured the kingdom's prosperity and protected its sovereignty. Europeans were not conquerors but trading partners, confined to coastal areas and subject to the laws and customs of Benin. This balance of power, however, was not destined to last. As the 19th century progressed, the interests of one European power, Great Britain, began to shift from trade to domination, setting the stage for a tragic and violent confrontation that would bring an end to a centuries-old kingdom. By the late 19th century, the Industrial Revolution had transformed Britain into a global superpower with, an insatiable appetite for raw materials. The palm oil and rubber produced in the region around Benin were absolutely essential for British factories and machines. What was once a relationship of commerce became a source of increasing frustration for British traders and colonial officials. They saw the Oba's strict control over trade, not as the legitimate exercise of sovereignty, but as an obstacle to profit and imperial expansion. The British Niger Coast Protectorate was established surrounding Benin and tightening the colonial grip on the region, making the independent kingdom an anomaly that the empire would not tolerate for long. The pressure on Benin began to mount. In 1892, a British official, Vice-Consul Henry Galway, traveled to Benin City and pressured Oba Ovonramwen to sign a treaty. This document, written in English and framed as a treaty of protection, was a classic tool of colonial coercion. It committed the Oba to abolishing the slave trade, a practice already in decline. But more importantly, it included clauses that required free trade and demanded the Oba consult with British officials on matters of governance. In essence, it was an attempt to strip the Oba of his economic and political power, turning a sovereign ruler into a colonial subject. Though the Oba signed it, he continued to enforce his trade monopoly, rightly viewing the treaty as a fundamental threat to his kingdom's independence. The British administration in the region was notoriously brutal, and their ambition was clear. Men like Consul George Annesley, who served before the final invasion, presided over a regime of extreme violence, a fact that was often covered up by colonial authorities who were more concerned with results than methods. The desire to bring Benin to heel was not just about economics, it was about imposing British will and demonstrating the absolute power of the empire. The Oba's refusal to bow to British demands was seen as an act of defiance, an affront that could not be ignored. The stage was being set for a confrontation, and the British were merely waiting for a pretext to act. This growing tension was fueled by a narrative that painted Benin as a savage and barbaric kingdom obsessed with human sacrifice. While rituals involving sacrifice did occur, they were exaggerated and sensationalized in the British press to create a moral justification for intervention. This portrayal ignored the kingdom's complex social structure, its artistic achievements, and its long history of organized governance. By framing Benin as a city of blood, the British were able to dehumanize its people in the eyes of the public back home, creating popular support for a military expedition that was, at its core, motivated by imperial greed and a desire for total control. The breaking point arrived in January 1897. The acting British consul, James Phillips, decided he would force a meeting with the Oba. Phillips was an ambitious and arrogant man, determined to make his mark by deposing the Oba and opening Benin up to British trade once and for all. He organized a delegation of 8 other Europeans and around 200 African carriers to march on Benin City. His timing, honestly, could not have been worse. The kingdom was observing the sacred Igwe festival, a period of intense religious significance during which the Oba was forbidden from seeing any non-native people. Messengers were sent to warn Phillips, pleading with him to delay his visit by 2 months, but he dismissed their warnings as a mere excuse. Driven by a fatal combination of arrogance and ignorance, Phillips pushed forward, convinced that his small, lightly armed party would be enough to intimidate the Oba. He had dangerously underestimated the resolve of the kingdom's leaders. As his column advanced toward the city, it was ambushed by Benin warriors led by a senior chief. The attack was swift and devastating. Phillips and most of the Europeans in his party were killed, along with many of the African carriers. The few survivors who made it back to the coast carried with them a story that would ignite the British Empire's fury. The British press immediately labeled the event a massacre, conveniently omitting the fact that Phillips had ignored repeated warnings and was leading an unauthorized and provocative mission. The response from London was immediate and overwhelming. A massive military force, officially called the Punitive Expedition, was assembled under the command of Admiral Harry Rawson. This was not a small-scale operation, it was a full-blown invasion. A force of approximately 1,500 soldiers was dispatched, armed with the most advanced weaponry of the day, including Maxim machine guns and rocket launchers. The technological disparity between the two sides was immense. The soldiers of Benin, fighting with courage and determination to defend their homeland, were armed primarily with muskets and swords. They stood little chance against the industrialized killing power of the British military machine. In February 1897, just over a month after the Phillips incident, the Punitive Expedition began its assault. The British forces advanced on Benin City from multiple directions, overwhelming the kingdom's defenses. When they reached the capital, they unleashed their firepower, shelling the city and setting it ablaze. The great palace of the Oba, the cultural and spiritual heart of the kingdom, was systematically destroyed. The once mighty kingdom of Benin was brought to its knees. Oba Ovonramwen managed to escape and went into hiding, but he was eventually captured and sent into exile. The sovereignty of Benin was extinguished, and its territory was absorbed into the British Empire. The destruction of Benin City was not only a military and political act, it was also an act of monumental cultural theft. As the city burned, British soldiers and officers engaged in systematic looting on a grand scale. They stripped the smoldering royal palace of its treasures, which had been accumulated over centuries. More than 4,000 priceless artifacts were stolen, including ivory carvings, ceremonial objects, and most famously, the Benin bronzes. These intricate plaques and sculptures, which represented the kingdom's history and soul, were treated as spoils of war. The expedition had been partly financed on the promise of this loot, and the treasures were seized to cover the costs of the invasion. The stolen artifacts were scattered across the globe. Many were taken back to Britain by the officers who had participated in the raid. Others were sold at auction in London, with museums in Germany, France, and the United States eagerly purchasing them. The British Museum acquired one of the largest collections, holding around 700 pieces. In this way, the historical record of the Benin Kingdom was dismantled and dispersed, its cultural heritage locked away in Western institutions. The bronzes were admired for their artistic beauty, but the violent story of how they got there was largely ignored, a footnote in the triumphant narrative of empire. Today, the story of the fall of Benin has entered a new chapter, the fight for restitution. For decades, Nigeria has been calling for the return of its stolen treasures. This campaign has gained significant momentum in recent years, as a new generation confronts the legacies of colonialism. In 2021, Jesus College, Cambridge, became one of the first Western institutions to return a Benin bronze. This was followed by similar actions from museums in Germany, France, and the Smithsonian in the United States. These acts of repatriation are more than just the return of objects. They are an acknowledgement of a historical injustice and a step toward cultural healing. However, the struggle is far from over. The British Museum, which holds the largest and most significant collection of the looted artifacts, has so far resisted calls for their permanent return, citing legal and institutional barriers. The debate over the Benin bronzes forces us to ask difficult questions about ownership, memory, and justice. Remembering the fall of Benin is crucial because it is a stark reminder of the brutal realities of colonial expansion. It tells a story not just of a kingdom's end, but of the enduring power of cultural identity and the ongoing quest to reclaim a stolen past.